It is widely known that the strongman is a sport for big guys, the biggest and most powerful people who walk the earth. People so big that even the bodybuilding mass monsters look like children next to them. Which is why in this video I decided to discuss the biggest strongmen, and for that purpose we will create our own strongman, an absolute giant who will borrow his constituents from the greatest among the greatest. Every construction worker will tell you that in order to build a solid construction, you need good foundations, and the foundations of the human body is the skeleton. If there's any strongman that stood out in this aspect, it was without a doubt Hafthor Julius Bjornsson, the world champion of 2018. Measuring 6 feet 9 inches, the mountain was born to gain muscle mass and use it to lift heavy weights. Plenty of strongmen have reached a mass of 440 pounds in their career, and it was clearly visible that they were a bit obese, but we're not talking about the aesthetic aspect here. It's more about the ability to gain more pounds of muscle on top of that. During the fight with Thor, Eddie Hall, visible in the picture, published a mini documentary presenting what kind of health he brought himself to while gaining so much weight, literally balancing on the edge of heart attack. It is not a surprise that after winning the title in 2017, he decided to finish his career. When we think back to Bjornsson, even at his peak weight when breaking the world record in deadlift, he still looked as if he could easily put on around a dozen more pounds. I will finish this by once again bringing up Bill Kazmaier's anecdote that I mentioned here before, which he originally told when interviewed by Matt Wenning. It goes that for a few years now, during the WSM, the athletes have had the component parameters of their bodies measured, such as bone mass. An average man's skeleton weighs 7 pounds, and we're talking about the mineral mass, as in without the marrow, blood, and other degradable substances. The skeleton of the before-mentioned Zydrunas Savickas, a 4-time world champion, was said to weigh 13 pounds, and that of Hafthor even twice as much. Now that we have something to attach individual body parts to, let's start with the legs. The choice here is pretty difficult because there are two ways to go about that. We can either choose the most powerful and massive legs, or ones that went down in history thanks to their achievements. In my research, however, I was helped by Mark Henry, whose enormous 36 inches thighs meet both those criteria. On top of the legs of the winner of the first Arnold in history being wider than most of us are at the waist, they have also achieved plenty of strength records, such as the 953-pound squat, for example, to this day unmatched in federations that identify as doping-free, and the heaviest that was achieved without equipment and monolift. Now let's talk about the back. Let's assume here that every strongman who was able to achieve the elite level wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for the huge airfield used to roll tons of metal, rocks, and other weird objects used in this competition. That's why I went for Eddie Hall here. His back will go down in history as the first to live up to the previously unimaginable task of lifting 500 kilograms on a barbell. I have to emphasize here that I'm using Hall's back more or less in 80% of its lower part, because the special distinction for the upper back goes to the Georgian bull, Konstantin Janashia. The Georgians' quadriceps seem to be a result of injecting synthol on account of how absurdly huge they are. Janashia himself denies those injections, explaining his condition with feeling terrible pain after a shoulder workout, which over time went away. What it left behind, though, was a muscle growth to the point visible in the picture. One hypothesis about the development of those bulges was a lipoma, a harmless tumor that causes adipose tissue to accumulate in unusual places, often around head. On top of that, as an argument against the synthol, the Georgian brought up the fact that it wouldn't be very responsible to inject this substance in your back on which you rest a few hundred kilograms in barbells or more than half a ton in yokes. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. Now's the time for the most important body part of a huge guy. The definition of masculinity and being an alpha male, which is the abdomen. It is another category that has plenty of candidates, but the absolute boss to me is the daddy, Glenn Ross. The Brit has brought more than 440 pounds on the deck, and although to many he was a nearly caricatural individual, his results in static battles, powerful arms, and chest allowed him to take the 3rd place in the Arnold and plenty of titles of the strongest man on the British Isles. His powerlifting total is just as impressive as the size of his abdomen, as it consists of a 915 pounds raw squat, 904 deadlift, and whole 650 pounds of bench press, which is a world-class result. Last but not least, believe it or not, that's what Ross looked like just a few years before he started his strongman career. Now let's discuss the chest. This is where I picked Bill Kazmaier, which is the first man in history to be able to bench press 300 kilograms and the only strongman who was no longer invited to the World's Strongest Man contests, which was explained by the competition being too dominated by him. It is partially true because nobody has ever won this title in such a landslide as Kaz did in 1980. Such powerful chest and huge weights, though, also carry certain consequences. Of course, besides jealous looks from competitors and admiration from beautiful ladies. What I'm talking about is the injuries suffered by the American left a hole in his chest after tearing his chest muscle one time too many. That was the price you pay for going down in history as one of the best strongmen and powerlifters in history. Now let's stick for a moment to the body parts responsible for pressing and focus on the shoulders. There is no way not to point to one of the strongest people in history here, which is Zydrunas Savickas. Maybe compared to other strongmen, the Lithuanian doesn't stand out with particularly visible hypertrophy of this part, but if we were to compare him with an average citizen, it is impossible not to notice certain differences. Either way, I'm placing Zydrunas' shoulders in this compilation not because of their size, but because of the weight they were able to lift above the Lithuanian's head. The world record in bar press maintained and improved on his own for nearly 20 years. World record in axle press, countless wins in repetition competitions make the Big Z the owner of not the biggest but certainly the most legendary shoulders in history. Now's the time for the biceps. For that purpose, I will bring up an individual many of you probably haven't heard of before because I'm talking about one of the most recognizable strongmen of the 90s, Manfred Hoberl from Austria. The two-time European champion could boast biceps with an unfathomable circumference of around 26 inches. Of course, there are even bigger circumferences among strongmen, such as Iron Biby with more than 27 inches, but I decided to focus a bit on the quality and not just the size, because at the African's body fat level, Manfred's biceps would probably be around 30 inches. That doesn't change the fact that both of them are owners of absolutely enormous arms, unattainable to basically all of the population. The upper limb, as we know, doesn't end at the elbow, which is why I also allowed myself to mention the forearm of Magnus Samuelsson, the world champion of 1999. The Swede was one of 5 people in the world to press level 4 Captain of Crush, a device that takes a clamping force of around 360 pounds to squeeze. The powerful grip of Samuelsson could be explained by his arm wrestling background, which Nathan Jones from Australia learned about in a painful way. If your forearm strength crushes the bones of other huge guys, it without a doubt deserves a distinction. Going even lower, let's move on to the hands. The owner of incredible ones is none other than Mark Felix. The Englishman of Grenadian ancestry has set a lot of world records during his long ongoing career, and he owes most of them to his huge hands with a spacing of 12 inches. To put in perspective just how big they are, take a look at a couple of pictures where Mark compares himself to regular people. The hosts of the Giants Live even printed leaflets with Felix's hand so that everyone could compare themselves to the Englishman's huge hands. Such complicated holes should also be completed with something on top. Being a strongman requires a lot of thinking and tactics from athletes. This is where Brian Shaw's head will come in handy, not just because it is beautiful and huge like a full moon, but also because he revolutionized this discipline with his brains and contributed a lot to its development. Picking the most important contests, calculating the effort in competitions, the professionalism, the marketing, and many other aspects contribute to the American's head being the best one. Alright, but what about the driving force? After all, every machine needs its engine, and in the human body it is obviously the heart. Here the choice is obvious: Mariusz Pudzianowski. The extremely fast in running competitions and tireless in his endurance pole has earned his distinction in this puzzle. I also appreciate Mariusz's heart in the metaphorical aspect because whenever he competed, he would put literally everything on the battlefield, and sometimes even more, like when fighting for his last record world championship, when despite a torn calf, he won at pulling a 44-ton airplane. So there we have it. This is what my perfect giant strongman looks like. Let me know if you agree with each choice and whether you think some other giant deserves being included in this puzzle.